All right, today we're going to do a deep dive into string gauges, and this is something I think we wanted to talk about for some time to kind of just go a little bit deeper into the different string gauges, what it kind of means for different types of characteristics, uh, um, some similarities, but also some things to keep in mind. And this is going to be focused more on tennis, but we're also going to touch on, how it maybe implies to badminton, squash, and racquetball as well, because these are all racket sports and they do use different gauges to some degree. I even had to look up the word gauge just to make sure that I spelled it right. You know how we always, like, sometimes I'll spell it GUA or whatever. So I did look it up, and this is the correct spelling. So
Okay, good.
all right, so let's get right into it. So I made this chart, and this chart breaks down strings into categories based on how they relate to the different sports. So as an example, hopefully this is kind of clear. What I'll do, let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger. There we go. So basically on the left side, we have the thicker strings, and then it goes to thin on the right-hand side. And you could see that for squash and racquetball, generally you're going to have strings between 16 and 18 gauge. And for tennis, it spans all the way back to 15 gauge and goes all the way basically to 20 gauge, somewhere in that range. And badminton generally is in the realm of 21 and 22 gauge. Now, when we're talking about numbers like that, we're talking about numbers that are related to the American system of measurement, right? Standard measurement. And I believe we're probably the only country that uses that. Everybody else uses the metric system, which makes a lot more sense to me. But and it also, I think it's important to make that distinction here, because with tennis strings, it makes a big difference, because you could say, hey, just put in a 16 gauge. But in reality, a 16 gauge could be something, if you look at the chart here, it could be something that maybe goes to as thick as 1.34, or it goes maybe as a little bit thinner to 1.26 gauge. And so some of the manufacturers even use different, if you're looking at it as a millimeter, if you're using it as a metric measurement, a 17 gauge in one brand could be thinner or thicker than a 17 gauge in another brand, or there might even be various options. And so that's why we really should look at it more. I tend to like to use millimeter in the metric. I'll give you an example here, and then Brad, we could talk about that a little bit. Let me go forward on this a little bit. So look at these two pictures. On the left, you have a picture of, it's a set of Solenko 17 gauge. This is what's written on the front of their packaging. And for their 17 gauge, it's 1.2 millimeter. And then if you look at this Wilson string, for their 17 gauge, it's 1.24. So it's a little bit of a difference. And those 4 points could make a difference as far as feel, as far as performance. And so it's not just a straight, 17 gauge. And so I always like to know what each of the strings has, and that's easy enough to do. You can go on Tennis Warehouse, where they have a good range of different tennis strings, and you can look at the different manufacturers, look at the different gauges, and kind of see where they fall within this, basically within this chart. Because I did also look at, like, is there one chart that you can use to get all of this information? And actually, there are slight differences depending on where you go to get your gauge chart. So as an example, first I did a simple Google search, and the first thing that came up was this chart on the left-hand side that goes from 15 to 19, and these are the numbers that it threw out at me. And then if you go a little bit further down the page, you get string gauges defined, and it breaks it down, a 15 light down to 20. And there's a few little differences here than what the one on the left gives. And then I went even a little bit further, and then I went onto Solinco's website, and this is what they had as far as the gauges and their conversion to millimeters. And you can also go to the USRSA. They have their own conversion chart as well. So there's a lot of different conversion charts, but for the most part, if you just stick with what I have outlined here, this gives you a good reference point. And if anybody wants this chart or something like it, I can provide that link to you if you leave a comment, subscribe, that kind of thing. So I guess, Brad, with that, let's maybe we can start talking about that.
Yeah, I think it's an important conversation if you're really trying to look for all the advantages and understand your racket, your technology, your string, and how it can affect you. And I had some examples just from my stringing business. I've got 3 different strings here, or actually I've got 4 here. So we've got. Oops, I lost you. Can you see me? So we got the Ashway Mono Gut, Solinco Hyper G, Technofiber Black Code, and a Head Hawk. And so we've got 16 gauge for the Mono Gut is 1.27 millimeters. Now I'm with you, Pat. I just think let's just use the number of what it is. Forget the 16, 17, 18, 16L, 19. Just go for what the millimeter is. So Ashway 16, 1.27. Now you've got Solinco, their 17 gauge is 1.2. But Head Hawk's 18 gauge is also 1.2, right? So you go head, here's Head Hawk Touch, 18. I don't know if you can see that.
Not too clear, but yeah, but what does it say for the 118?
For 18 gauge, 1.2 millimeter, Head Hawk Touch.
Yeah, and I know some 18 gauge would be 1.4, 1.14.
And Solinco's 17 is 1.2, like you showed. And then you've got Technofiber's 17 is 1.24 for the black code, which is hard to see. Yeah. So there's 3 different 17s that are quite a bit different from each other. So you really want to just go by the millimeters, and that's the best way to do it. And then, we'll talk about, how a thicker or thinner might benefit you or help you or hurt you in certain ways with certain materials and stuff. Yeah, because, it comes down to like sometimes customers want the thinnest string possible. So you go, oh, well, the thinnest string is nowadays they have string, the 19 gauge, or you can even go to 20 gauge. But what does that really mean? So, within that range, you can go even a little bit thinner if you knew what manufacturer has that thinner string. And I know a lot of the Luxilon strings go, I used to like some of the 18 gauge Luxilon, and like you're talking about there, goes pretty thin as well. And Luxilon actually only puts it on the Luxilon only puts the millimeter on the front of the package, and on the back you see 17, 18 or whatever, but on the front.
Yeah, and that's because obviously a lot of these companies are international, and if it wasn't necessarily started in the US or its biggest market is in the US, it would probably the numbers would probably be American, but since most of it is so international, everybody uses the millimeter. And that brings me to, like, when I looked up some of the badminton strings, most of those don't even have the American system on it. It's basically just it's 0.64 or it's 0.71 or something like that, as far as for badminton. So you can't even find on a lot of them. Maybe if you actually had the package, it might show it on there somewhere. But when I was looking them up, I couldn't find a lot of information related to the American measurement system on badminton strings. And a lot of those do come out of, Japan or China and so forth, right? So so I kind of made this chart just so kind of you can see. Obviously, tennis spans the bigger spectrum of tensions when it comes to strings, and so I think as a tennis stringer, it's good to know kind of where racquetball and squash fall in, and they basically fall into that 16 to 18. But again, if you want to kind of finesse or specialize in, offering the best options for your clients, knowing all of the different manufacturers and what gauges, it'd be easy enough to create a graph based on look up the manufacturers that you use, and then kind of look at where their rating is, and then you can put it all in one chart, and you can kind of have a comparison like, oh yeah, this is the thinnest string that I see out of these manufacturers. And so that gives you that idea. And why does it really matter to that degree? Well, we could look at, and I just took a picture of, sometimes too, if you take a string gauge tester or string gauge measurement device kind of like this, and you could put the strings in, they're not always going to be perfect because every string is kind of like, it might go from a little bit thicker in some areas or whatever. But this way you can actually use one of these gauges and measure it yourself as well. But I know some people who use those a little bit more diligently. But yeah, so let's get into why does it even matter? And I think I have it down to 5 core things that I think are important, and what thinner strings and how they affect different characteristics. And the first thing is the increased elasticity. Okay, so thinner strings tend to be more elastic than the thicker counterparts, and this increased elasticity is going to allow the string to stretch more on impact with the ball, and then creates more of that trampoline-like effect and can generate more power. So I think thinner strings could create more power, and I think that's the theory that a lot of people tend to go to. I mean, I am not a physics trained person, and so I really don't know how a lot of the physics work, but from a lot of the information I've read, this kind of goes along with the majority of thought. And I know I'll get some people chiming in on this and have a different opinion, and there are probably, if you're really a scientist or a physicist, you're probably going to have a little bit more depth into this conversation. But for the sake of what we're going over, I think this is good enough.
And with that elasticity, you're going to get, that's why they say with thinner strings, you're going to get more, you're going to generate more topspin also, because that elasticity is going to provide more snapback. And snapback is going to be what helps you to create more spin. And there's other variables. A more open string pattern is going to give you more snapback, things like that. And the certain shape of the string and the coating and all that. But
and then this next one here that I have, it slices through the air and reduces drag a little bit. Oops, I switched it. Reduces drag a little bit, and so it kind of enhances the speed of the racket swing, and that potentially could, create extra power as well.
And also better on your arm. It's softer, it's less stiff, so it's going to be a much more arm friendly. If you're prone to injury, or if you had injuries, a thinner string will benefit you better. And also then you get into what material string should you use to really help that.
Right. Yeah. And better ball bite, and then the greater feel. So there's lots of reasons why we tend to go to thinner strings, but there's always that break even point of durability and performance, because at some point, for a lot of people to play with 18, 19 gauge strings is not feasible for their budget or for other reasons, just the inconvenience of stringing it every day. But
my son breaks them every 3 months. Like, so, you're lucky. That's not bad.
So you have to come. You have to find that balance, that break even for you, right? Yeah. It's almost like the old economics curve, right? Where like the two meet, and then that center point, that's where you go for, wherever your pain point is. Like, okay, I'm willing to, stretch it out to such and such time frame, and so I'll use a 17 gauge because it lasts me twice as long than an 18 gauge, and the playability is X amount better. And I don't want to go to a 15 light because I just don't like the playability or the feel or the spin potential on that. Sometimes you can play with the different materials of the string to make some adjustments there as well. But generally, we all try to go. I think the idea is always to go as thin as you can for whatever you're trying to get out of it.
One thing about the slide, if you don't have to go back, but before that, even back right here, I at least for me, and if there's beginner stringers out here, it is highly unusual to have anything, I think, thinner than like 1.15 or 1.10. You can, but it's just very unusual. And it's on the other end, to me, it's very unusual to have anything thicker than like 1.34, 1.35. So I would, for me, the more of the range for college players, professionals is to me going to be more in the 1.2 to 1.3. I think professionals are going to be closer to 1.25 to 1.3.
Yeah. And you're also not going to see a lot of 15 gauge strings anymore. I think back in the day, they had some natural gut. I think Pete Sampras even, didn't he use like 15 gauge gut? Or there were some players I remember way back when that would use 15 gauge gut. Maybe that was even like McEnroe or something.
I use 15 gauge Wilson Sensation for players that have developed arm issues with full polyester. I'll put a thicker Sensation 1.35 in the crosses, and in both cases, the players, it's helped them to recover and then go back to the full poly a little thinner.
But no, it's good that you brought that point up, because it's very rare that we're going to see 19. It's not something that you would normally stock. I mean, if you were stocking string, you'd have some 15 light, a lot of 16 gauge. Probably a lot of 17 gauge, and then maybe some 18 gauge. You could even get away with, just so that you have a good representation. And depending on, like, a lot of times with the thinner strings, I would use it in a hybrid kind of setup.
And your multi-filaments will mostly, I would recommend getting only 16 gauge in the multi-filaments, because those do break much faster. Whereas my polyesters, I generally go 1.2 and 1.25 only. I do have one client who I string quite a bit for who likes 1.15. So, I stock that, but.
Yeah. So I think that was kind of a good overview of looking at string gauges and how they relate to the different, types of racket sports, and specifically with tennis, how it could make an impact as far as looking at the individual manufacturers and where they fall, and use the metric measurement system and stay away from the American way of looking at it. And it's easy enough to convert. If somebody comes to you and say, put a 16 gauge in there, and they're like, oh, I want something a little bit thinner, or, you can kind of tell them, well, this string is a 16 gauge, and it's a little bit thicker than this one that's a 16 gauge. And so if you want that same playability, we can go to this one and get you a little thinner one, or, so there's just a lot of things. It helps you if you, as the racket string professional, knows more about gauges and can use that information to better fit strings to your client's needs. So, any final thoughts, Brad? I mean,
no, I'm glad we finally did this video. We've talked about it on and off, and it is a big part of understanding strings and how you can help your clients and selecting the right strings and what they do, and how many different gauges there are out there. Literally 1.26, 1.27, 1.24, 1.22. All these companies are all over the place, but I don't. That's really about it.
And everywhere you go, if you look at getting, like I was saying, I looked on Google, I looked on different individual websites. Solinco has one, and the USRSA, and you can use all that information, create your own, or just look at the strings that you carry and create a chart, on that, so that way you have it all in one place. And if anybody needs help with that, just leave a comment. I hope this was useful, helpful. Please like and subscribe this, share it with somebody else. This is just, I think, some basic information, but everybody really needs to kind of have a handle on what it all means. And so I think we kind of did a little deeper dive into that. And with that, I'll say we'll see you in the next video.
Thanks, Pat.